You might ask, how can I prove it to you? What evidence can I show you of its existence? One of the things that happened during my own journey exploring this territory was that the man who taught me about this material described to me in one of our earliest conversations on the matter how he approached it when he was younger, when he first came across these ideas. This dialogue is linked in the appendix where you can listen to him talk about this content. Initially, he thought that when his friends and he were talking about psi phenomena and about synchronicity, that it was just a waste of time, that they were talking about nothing. So that intrigued me because I thought that this was the correct attitude, and I was curious how he could have transitioned from that point of view to the one he had now, given that all my discussions with him thus far had proved him to be extremely well educated and remarkably articulate, with a coherent and rigid epistemology. But the topic he was talking about was something I regarded as ridiculous and likely delusional: the inability of another to think critically. This was a little bit of a dissonance in my mind. So sparkling was his intelligence, yet I was to suppose that he had simply confused himself into these elaborate ideas about reality that had no basis in any facts, experiential or otherwise. So what I then thought to myself was that I would listen to him talk about this and listen to his stories, but I would not believe him. In fact, for most of the time when I was listening to him speak, I explicitly disbelieved him. Not as a person, just that it could be possible, that his stories could be true or real, because some of them were so fantastical, so beyond anything I have ever experienced. I too thought it was probably a waste of time to talk about these things, but I was willing to listen and explore, and as I listened, I noticed he didn't describe to me a way that I should come to believe what he did, but merely a path that I could walk if I wanted to see what he meant. And so, disbelieving my teacher, I walked the path he told me about, so that I could check it out, and so that I could prove to myself that the things he said must have some other explanation. It took me 6 months of telling myself there is another explanation and searching for it before I accepted that the explanation was simple. This was real, and all that remained in my mind was to explain to myself at the very least how it worked. So I do not ask you to believe me, but neither can I prove it to you. This is a part of the world that you can only ever explore yourself, and that you will have to make your own mind up about after a period of consideration which is appropriate in light of the evidence. What evidence can I show you of its existence? Nothing more than my own stories, my own experiences, my own parallels with others who I work with. My parallels with you, perhaps. I can tell you what type of evidence I have found, and what your evidence might look like, and even maybe where you might be able to look to find it, but I can never show it to you directly. Only you can achieve that feat. As an example of the kind of thinking which both considers openly the possibility of meaningful coincidences and is also critical about them, here is a passage from Jung. Listen to his careful, analytical attitude on the matter, and pay special attention to the way he accounts for cognitive biases, the way he searches diligently for a causal or rational explanation, and the way he reasons about the validity of the series as an example of synchronicity. Jung writes, chance groupings or series seem, at least to our present way of thinking, to be meaningless, and to fall as a general rule within the limits of probability. There are, however, incidents whose chancefulness seems open to doubt. To mention but one example out of many, I noted the following on April 1st, 1949. Today is Friday. We have fish for lunch. Somebody happens to mention the custom of making an April fish of someone. That same morning, I made a note of an inscription which read, Est humo totus medius piscis ab imo. In the afternoon, a former patient of mine, whom I had not seen for several months, showed me some extremely impressive pictures of fish which she had painted in the meantime. In the evening, I was shown a piece of embroidery with fish-like sea monsters in it. On the morning of April 2nd, another patient, whom I had not seen for many years, told me a dream in which she stood on the shore of a lake and saw a large fish that swam straight towards her and landed at her feet. I was at this time engaged in a study of the fish symbol in history. Only one of the persons mentioned here knew anything about it. The suspicion that this must be a case of meaningful coincidence, i.e. an acausal connection, is very natural. I must own that this run of events made a considerable impression on me. It seemed to me to have a certain numinous quality. In such circumstances, we are inclined to say that cannot be mere chance, without knowing exactly what we are saying. The strength of an impression, however, proves nothing against the fortuitous coincidence of all these fish. It is, admittedly, exceedingly odd that the fish theme recurs no less than 6 times within 24 hours. But one must remember that fish on Friday is the usual thing, and on April 1st one might very easily think of the April fish. I had at that time been working on the fish symbol for several months. Fish frequently occur as symbols of unconscious contents. So there is no possible justification for seeing this as anything but a chance grouping. Runs or series, which are composed of quite ordinary occurrences, must for the present be regarded as fortuitous. However wide their range may be, they must be ruled out as acausal connections. It is, therefore, generally assumed that all coincidences are lucky hits and do not require an acausal interpretation. This assumption can, and indeed must, be regarded as true so long as proof is lacking that their incidence exceeds the limits of probability. As a pendant to what I have said above, I should like to mention that I wrote these lines sitting by the lake. Just as I had finished this sentence, I walked over to the sea wall and there lay a dead fish, about a foot long, apparently uninjured. No fish had been there the previous evening. Presumably it had been pulled out of the water by a bird of prey or a cat. The fish was the 7th in the series. You might ask, where should I begin if I want to find evidence of my own? Well, first and foremost, I would suggest that this lecture series is the best way for you to learn about this material, and that you engage with the content of each lecture in your own way during the period of time between each presentation, exploring the material discussed during these lectures through a series of personal investigations, followed by discussions with other people that either know about this territory or are learning about it too. The best way to approach this is to think of it as a study, something to explore, meditate on, and discuss, in a cycle that continually refines the approach you are taking to each step in the process. For this refinement, the discussion step is crucial because it allows the externalization of the framework one is using to think about the experience, and that alone can alert an individual to the shadow of their projection, that which is hidden from view or deselected from focus. Yet the key strength of the dialogical articulation of the framework is in the ability not of oneself to notice, but of the other person to participate in a sort of game of free association that brings to the surface alternative resonant threads which run thematically parallel to one another. Through this activity of free association, those individuals who are undertaking an exploration of the material encounter a relatively unique opportunity to perform a form of verification, to ask yourself, what did the other person share unexpectedly, and how did that relate to what you shared with them? Therefore, a chief resource in the study of synchronicity is to be found in the act of swapping stories, and of offering, freely and authentically, anything which occurs during this process of storytelling. In concert with this storytelling, you are encouraged to engage in a critical meta-analysis of the kinds of assumptions being made in the interpretations offered by others, and to attempt to conceive of the consequences such assumptions might have on their experiences of their experiments. This means making the discussions about the stories that are swapped self-referential in nature. Through this recursion, the analysis is refined, and thus so too is the interpretation. In the process of participating in a developmental dialogue that centers around the topic of synchronicity, what one is likely to notice is that the synchronistic qualia in question are actually precipitated around the dialogue, which is to say, appear in a temporally proximate window as signs or metaphors that reflect the very topics discussed during the dialogue. This offers a relatively simple avenue of exploration because it means that the mere activity of talking about these kinds of things should, in effect, cause them to occur, though I use that word only in lieu of a term more appropriate. Specifically, the themes which characterize your personal explorations of the material are constellated as signs or omens in synchrony with the attempt to bring the same themes to conscious light during the dialogue. This act of bringing them to light does exactly that, but in the world at large. To illustrate just what it is that I mean by the themes which characterize your explorations, allow me to share some details about my mentor's gradual immersion in this phenomenon. When he first came across these ideas, he took a very literary approach to the world and thought in terms such as omens and foreshadowing, because these themes were prevalent in the literature that he had used to educate himself and therefore influenced his analytical framework. Consequently, when he began to investigate synchronicity, it first manifested in his world through these terms most natural to his way of thinking, which were those of literature. Therefore, he experienced such things as foreshadowing and omens, and he started to believe that there was a reality to these notions which was not easily or simply reducible to their utility in communication. He began to believe, on the basis of his experience, that they might actually be real in some strange way. Something he used to say was that one has to imagine that the phenomenology they would experience might be different to the phenomenology he would experience. From this we may infer that the reality of the phenomenon is experienced in those terms one most easily relates to, which is to say via those metaphors that most resonate with the way the person experiences and conceives of their phenomenal world. Therefore, in order to find evidence of your own, all you really need to do is listen carefully to the facts of the events that are recounted, and then ask questions about what state of mind is required to experience that evidentiary stream, followed by a personal exploration of your own, which necessitates an honest attempt to interpret the qualia, because at the point of experience it is no longer just a story. It has become your reality. How does one distinguish between meaningful coincidence and mere coincidence? In the beginning, every coincidence will present itself as mere coincidence, and the honest investigator must patiently undergo a very gradual process in order to begin to recognize that there can be meaningful coincidence, because the predisposition to believe in mere coincidence corresponds to a proclivity to rationalize away the anomalies of your experience. This means that one must open themselves up to the possibility before one will be able to hold such anomalies within the mind at length. A technique that I often recommend to people when it comes to exploring this material is to conceptualize what I call an anomaly box, which is an essentially logical construction that is supposed to contain odd things that happen which don't quite make sense, and they are put in the box to be explained at a later date. The box allows you to stack up these anomalies over time, and if you are patient, then you are eventually able to organize the contents of this box into categories that show you what is undeniably true. That the exception too is part of the rule. It is merely a question of how. The key to collecting the experiences which will form the contents of this anomaly box is the willingness to be patient in relation to the phenomena you are exploring, or the willingness to leave the world unexplained, paired with the tendency to return to the experiences and explore them again in an attempt to integrate them into a logically cohesive framework. In order to reliably distinguish between meaningful coincidence and mere coincidence, as opposed to overdiagnosing either of the two, one must be willing to abstain from compulsive closure, the act of projecting upon the world an explanation that does not quite fit in order to move on to other things. One must be willing to suspend the compulsion to either explain or dismiss, and to instead become comfortable with recognizing the peculiar nature of certain coincidences, and collecting them together for later separation into categories. Mindfulness is also key, both in the collection of the evidence as well as in the process of separating these experiences into categories, which are characterized by common elements, as it is the quality which allows one to notice the resonant associations between facts and experiences that properly distinguish meaningful coincidence from mere coincidence, and to further discriminate the degree of interrelation. To be blunt, mere coincidence is the co-occurrence of events in the absence of any meaningful connection that is not also causal in nature, and to determine the difference, one must be mindful in their meditations and their explorations in relation to the matter. When the technique of mindfulness is applied in this way, what one will find is that certain details stand out to one's mind without a clear logical reason why they should, and that following such cues is the key to this art. Hey guys, thanks for watching that lecture excerpt. For more, subscribe to my channel and don't forget to check out my Patreon and my other work linked in the description below.